After you have set up your routing rules, you will most likely want to test their work prior to pushing live traffic through the system. For that, we have two options. The first is called simulation. Here, you basically emulate a request for routing similar to the one the switch sends when receiving a new SMS. So for that, you need to select a customer, the POI for that customer, and the B number. You can also specify the time moment to emulate the request. Pressing the Get Routes button triggers the analysis procedure, and the system gives out the list of routes just the same way as it would provide this list of routes back to the switch. Here on this list you see vendors number 1, 2, 3, etc. based on the priority the routing system gave to each of them. You can see the weight of vendors in case they are dynamically selected, the vendor and the product name, the global unique ID of the vendor channel, the service type of any, the B number, the E212 code, the statistics for the customer and each of the vendors, and also the customer and vendor rates, the margin, and the ID of the routing rule that was triggered. And if something looks wrong, you can press the View Log link so that the system will open a new tab with a very detailed log showing you how exactly the routing was working on this message. From the very first stage, looking for client, identifying the channel, the POI, the product, the customer name, identifying the MCC/MNC code that needs to be applied for this message, finding the customer rate, checking the balance, then looking for vendor rates for that MCC/MNC. After that, applying possible limitations related to vendors, for example, lack of balance or no POI or no channel configured or no valid agreement, and dropping the vendors because of these extra conditions. And finally, to those vendors who remain on the list, the system starts applying routing rules. For each of them, it gives you a complete log of whether or not the rule was triggered, how the weight calculation went, the margin checkup, everything. And finally, the system ends up with the list of the routes that it will return back to the switch. This log is extremely helpful when it comes to debugging routing. So this was option number 1. And option number 2 is called Send SMS. And it's actually self-explanatory because it literally gives you the possibility to send an SMS generated by the system through the routing system to a real vendor if it's configured. So typically it's very good during the system setup time when you can test the route sending messages to your own cell phone. So here you can just type in the recipient phone number, the sender ID, which may be whatever, the message, and then you can select the customer channel that you want the system to use as the fake originator, because the system needs to know the customer to apply the routing logics. So here is where you define which customer is sending this message so that the system can route it accordingly. So the message will go to the routing rules, the system will select a vendor if configured, and send the message to that vendor. So if everything works fine, you'll receive a hello from your SMS system.